Introducing the next generation from Nintendo. It's 16-bit, and it's yours only if you get new Super Nintendo. Now you're playing with power, superpower.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Ultimate Super Nintendo review here on Player One Start. Today we're going to talk about the launch of the North American Super Nintendo. We're going to talk about the revisions of the Japanese console to North America, as well as its console revision in its later life, that being the Super Nintendo 2 or the SNES 2. I actually don't remember what the real model name is, but I'll cover that later on. And of course, we're going to talk about the history of the resistance of parents to upgrade from the Nintendo to the Super Nintendo. It's something that seems kind of crazy now, but think about the perspective of someone in the 1990s, or at least parents. Back in the day, they bought an Atari. Nintendo was a competing product, so when it came out, it wasn't supposed to be backwards compatible with the Atari. They kind of got that. But Atari was often criticized for not being backwards compatible when they released the 5200, and so they eventually built that backwards compatibility into the 7800 in 1984 when it initially launched. But Nintendo's popularity was still on the rise when the Super Nintendo was announced, so parents who had just bought a Nintendo Entertainment System may have been blindsided with, oh, by the way, there's a new system coming out, and no, the original cartridges will not work on this new system. Kids saw the benefits, parents really didn't. So as I remind you that it wasn't necessarily a given that Super Nintendo was going to be a huge hit, I will remind you to click on that subscribe button and the bell icon to be notified when I make future posts in this series, and we'll go ahead and get started. The hype over the next Nintendo Entertainment System was one of the most anticipated events as we entered the 1990s. Super Mario Bros. 3 was breaking sales charts for video games being released in 1990, and many kids' imaginations went wild with what would Nintendo provide next. However, as kids all across the United States were anticipating one of the biggest console releases of all time in their minds, parents were of a different opinion.
Our video game industry is hotter than ever this season, and one good reason, Nintendo has introduced some hot new toys. But have things gone a bit too far?
So it has come to this. Therapy sessions for families whom you could call Nintendependent.
First of all, the peer pressure starts. I feel maybe exploited.
Just in time for Christmas, the Japanese toy maker Nintendo has come out with a new set of electronic video games. Some parents are refusing to be taken in.
I'm going to say no, and I'm going to explain to him how people market things to make you spend more money.
Nintendo controls 80% of the video market.
One of the downsides of the launch of the Super Nintendo in the United States was the fact that many were still jumping on board for the first time with the Nintendo Entertainment System, with Nintendo's sales being incredibly strong all throughout 1990 and in the beginning of 1991. Some parents who had just invested into a Nintendo Entertainment System hoping it would keep their kids calm for at least the next few years to come were bitterly disappointed when they found out that the Super Nintendo would not be backwards compatible with the previous Nintendo Entertainment System library. However, by the time the Super Nintendo launched, this would not be as big of a factor as was anticipated, at least by the video game media. You know, isn't that a tale as old as time? Kid wants something, parent doesn't. It always seems throughout history that there's been like this innate struggle of the younger generation versus the older generation. I've seen it multiple times throughout my study of American history and world history. That's why I say it is a tale as old as time. Thinking back in the early 1980s when the arcade boom was up and Atari was king, parents were upset saying, oh, my kid spends all their time at the arcade. They're just going to waste. It's going to drain their brain power, and they're just going to rot in front of the television screens. I mean, it's all that stuff that really wasn't that big of a deal, but it really provoked strong reactions from both the younger generation and the older generation. It's just something I've kind of noticed, that this happened in the 1980s, the 1990s, it happened again in the 2000s, and happened again in the 2010s, so there's going to be a lot more of this history to cover as we go through other consoles. Just wanted to make a note of it here. As with the Famicom to the Nintendo Entertainment System, the Super Famicom would get a complete redesign in terms of cosmetics, designed to appeal more to an American audience. The console was given a more boxy appearance, and the color scheme was changed a bit, giving it a purple and gray aesthetic. The cartridges themselves would also get a redesign, but would still remain about the same size as the Super Famicoms. In fact, as a measure of region locking, the cartridge design was actually made a little bit bigger so they wouldn't fit in a Super Famicom, and the Super Famicom carts would not physically fit into the connector for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System due to the plastic molding, preventing the cartridge from fitting into the cart connector. The Super Nintendo launched in North America in limited quantities on August 23, 1991 for the retail price of $199, equivalent to almost $400 in 2022. The official nationwide rollout would begin on September 9th, and it again was an instant success. By the end of 1991, Nintendo held the top 3 positions on the top video game console charts with the Game Boy, Super Nintendo, and Nintendo Entertainment System. The Super Nintendo would make its debut in the United Kingdom and Ireland in April of 1992, but most of the PAL region versions of the console would use the Japanese Super Famicom design. Both the Super Nintendo and the Super Famicom would launch with just a few games, but these games were all very well received in the marketplace. However, despite their initial success, they would be in bitter competition with rival Sega throughout most of this next generation. The rivalry between Nintendo and Sega is often described as one of the most notable console wars in video game history. Sega was positioning the Genesis as the cool console aimed at older audiences, where the Nintendo Entertainment System had gained a reputation as being for something for kids. Nintendo would push back against this image several times throughout the console's life cycle, with one of the earliest examples being that Nintendo secured the first home console conversion of Capcom's arcade hit Street Fighter II for the Super Nintendo. During the era of the NES, Nintendo maintained exclusive control over the games released for their system. Nintendo had to approve every game. Each third-party developer could only release up to 5 games per year, but some third parties would get around this by using different company names, such as Konami having an Ultra Games brand. And a key to the NES's success was that the games could not be released for another console within 2 years. All throughout the NES's lifecycle, Nintendo would remain the exclusive manufacturer and supplier of all NES cartridges, at least all those that were officially licensed, as companies like Atari's Tengen would challenge this, as well as bring their concerns to the US government about Nintendo's anti-competitive business practices and price fixing.
The men sitting in this room control the American video game industry. Nintendo controls 85% of the US video game market. Companies that try to compete with Nintendo have an uphill fight. It's no surprise Toys R Us tries not to offend Nintendo. Competitors claim Nintendo games represent 15% of Toys R Us revenues, but 25% of its profit.
Due to the fact that the market was pretty much reset after the video game crash, Nintendo was able to gain a very strong lead over the US video game market. And when the top retailers in the US wanted to stock Nintendo's products, if it wasn't written into their contract, it was an understanding that they would not stock Nintendo's competitors, or Nintendo would threaten that they would cut off their supply, leaving that one retailer at a disadvantage as every other retailer would be stocking the very popular Nintendo products. But that's not the only condition that retailers had to agree to in order to stock Nintendo's stuff.
Parents may wonder why there's almost never a Nintendo sale. The Federal Trade Commission recently discovered how Nintendo keeps its prices high. The FTC found Nintendo guilty of price fixing.
Nintendo was fined for price fixing by the US government, and they chose to pay their fine by offering discounts to consumers on future Nintendo products. Circling back to the contract with third-party game licensees, Nintendo is still requiring third-party developers to keep their games exclusive to Nintendo's products. However, beginning in 1991, Sega's competition would bring an end to this practice. One of the earliest examples of this was by Acclaim Entertainment when they began producing games for both platforms, the Super Nintendo and the Sega Genesis. Most of Nintendo's other licensees would follow suit over the next several years. One of the biggest third-party developers for Nintendo, Capcom, which had licensed some of its games to Sega instead of producing them directly, along with another huge third-party developer for Nintendo, Square, would be the most notable holdouts. Nintendo would continue to carefully review submitted games, scoring them on a 40-point scale, and allocating marketing resources accordingly. Nintendo of America would also maintain a policy that, among other things, limited the amount of violence that could be shown on games on its system. The surprise arcade hit Mortal Kombat in 1992, which was a gory fighting game that had huge splashes of blood and graphically violent fatality moves, was heavily censored by Nintendo. Because the Genesis version allowed for an uncensored version of the game via a cheat code, it would outsell the censored Super Nintendo version by a ratio of nearly 3-1. Nintendo had a very prominent presence in the congressional hearings on December 9, 1993, in which U.S. Senators Herb Kohl and Joe Lieberman investigated the marketing of violent video games to children. Nintendo took the moral high ground with moderate success, but the hearings would lead to the creation of the Interactive Digital Software Association and the Entertainment Software Ratings Board that would require all video games to display a rating with their game. With these ratings in place, Nintendo decided its censorship policies were no longer needed and abandoned the practice for the most part. Console sales in 1992 still showed that Nintendo had a lead over Sega, however, Sega was closing the gap, and fast. As Sega geared up to release its Sega CD add-on for its Genesis console to enable it to play CD-ROM-based games, Nintendo would contract with 2 different companies to help develop a CD-ROM-based peripheral for their console as well. However, both of these partnerships would fall through for different reasons, each with embarrassing and detrimental consequences to Nintendo. The contract with Philips allowed them to create games based on Nintendo franchises for its CDI multimedia console, and these games are generally considered some of the worst games ever produced, not only in their respective franchises, but in the entire history of video games. Nintendo's deal with Sony did lead to a working prototype that was discovered years later, but would end up never being released as Nintendo famously dropped Sony as a partner, leading to embarrassment for them, but eventually motivating them to develop their own video game console and compete directly against Nintendo. In the end, a CD-based peripheral would never release for the system, but I believe that is due to the fact that the Sega CD wasn't a huge success for Sega, and by the time the peripheral would have come out, it would have been too close to the next generation of video game consoles, so Nintendo eventually scrapped the project altogether. Instead, they would focus on their built-in way to add enhancement chips to cartridges to boost system performance for enhanced games. In the end, all the media reports and all the parents' bluster and all the kids whining really led to another successful launch for Nintendo. And I think this is where a lot of the hype that people remember from back in the day was really about arguing which system was better, will the Super Nintendo be a success? And when you look at history, it almost seemed like it was not even a question. But here on this channel, and with this video, I hope to show that it wasn't necessarily a guarantee that Nintendo would have a successful launch. And with Sega on the rise, Nintendo would have one of their biggest battles as a company that they would ever face in the history of their company. So that about finished it up for the launch. In the next video, we're going to tear down this system and we're going to take a look at the tech specs about what makes the Super Nintendo so much better than the Famicom and better than its competition. So stay tuned for that part coming out to you real soon. If you like this video and you'd like to help out with future projects on this channel, please consider supporting me on Patreon. A special thanks to those Patreons you see on screen. Also, if you like what you see, please remember to leave a like and click that subscribe button on your way out. As always, I want to thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you all in the next video.